give you credit for it, sir. So my rear gunner, he was the youngest in the crew, Kenny Taylor. He came from a mixed farm at Mayerthorpe, Alberta. So I told Kenny what the situation was. I said, what do you think we should do? The wing commander said they got a lot of orphan crew members here. They'd lost their crews. They were in the hospital. Crews never came back. So he said, if you'd like to continue flying, we're going to convert to Lancasters. And I can easily get you a crew of orphan crew members. So I told Kenny, and he said to me, well, Skipper, if the rest of the fellows on the squadron know that we're fit to fly and we don't fly, they'll think we're cowards. And I said, oh gosh, that would never do. So the end result was they made up a crew of orphan crew members. And then my wing commander Mitchell, said, well, Crash, he said, maybe your luck will change. Well, I guess I must be jinxed, because the very first trip I did to Lancaster, I only had 2 hours or 2 to 3 hours sitting in the cockpit, familiarized myself with the controls, and then they said, well, you can take your crew on a air-to-sea firing and they can test their guns. We got back, and then that night we went on our first trip. And then I got a message from the wireless operator to say that we'd been diverted. So here I am in the brand new Lancaster. And we've been diverted to a drone equipped with FIDO. I don't know if you ever heard of FIDO, but that's where they have I think there were 3 of them in England, and we went to one called Tottenham. They have pipes on either side of the runway with holes in them, and they force 100-octane fuel through them, set it on fire, but in order to line up with a runway, you have to use your Morse code. We took Morse code when we were doing our service flying. I often wondered why I had to learn Morse code. But when you got to England, all the pilots that were going to be bomber pilots went on what they call a BAT course, beam approach training. It was all under the hood, and you had to use your Morse code to get there. So when we got to Tottenham, I had forgotten what the signals were, because I'd spent 10 weeks in the hospital. It was well over a year since I'd used the Morse code. My first thought was, well, if I can't remember the signals, we can always bail out. And then another thought saying, oh my gosh, commanding officers won't be very happy if I bail out of a brand new Lancaster. So
after just having bailed out of a Halifax.
Yeah. They say you should never panic, just sit there and something will come to you. So I somehow got myself back to the church loft from the beam approach training, and I remembered what the signal was to the port side, and then the signal to the starboard side came to me, and if you got lined up with a runway, you got a different signal, a steady signal. Well, I crossed the runway about 3 times, and the control tower kept calling, wanted to know where I was. Well, of course, I didn't know where the heck I was. But to make a long story short, after about the 4th try, I got lined up with the runway, and I came down to 1,200 feet, to 1,000 feet, 900 feet. I was still in fog, and then about 800 feet, the fog cleared, and there's 2 walls of fire. So my thought was, well, this is my first night landing in the Lancaster, so I better keep the thing between these 2 walls of fire, because I glanced at the port side and I saw Halifax burning. So to make a long story short, I managed to get down. So that was my first trip. 2 nights later, we went on our 2nd trip, and we were on the bombing run. And all of a sudden, the mid-upper gunner said, "Skipper, there's a Halifax shooting at us. What'll I do?" I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Yeah, I can see the son of a gun." I said, "Well, shoot back at him." Well, it turned out it was a new crew on their first trip, and they got all except they set an engine on fire, but the engineer managed to get it out. We were on the bombing run, so I had to keep the aircraft straight and level. They got back to the station all excited, and they told them that they'd shot down an unidentified four-engine German night fighter. Well, of course, you all know the Germans didn't have any four-engine planes. So I could hear the bullets hitting the aircraft, and we were fortunate. When they're firing machine guns, they fire a lot of bullets in a very short time. And all the bullets came down on the port side, which is where all the hydraulics are. And when I went to close the bomb doors, they would only close part way. So I flew home with the bomb doors almost open. It was no big deal because I still had put enough power. Then when I got into the circuit, I looked out and I said, "Wheels down." My engineer looked out and he said, "There's no wheel here, Skipper." So I said, "Well, there's supposed to be a crank in this aircraft. See if you can find the crank." Well, he couldn't find the crank. I said, "Well, there's an air bottle charged at 1,200 pounds, so see if that'll work." Well, he tried that and he still didn't get the wheel. So in the meantime, the control tower said, "Stand by for further instructions." Finally, they said, "Well, you have to go to a crash drome." And England had 3 crash dromes. One was in Lincolnshire, one was in Carnaby, which was about 40 miles from where my relatives lived in Hull, and the other one was just north of London. And those crash dromes, the runways were about 3 miles long, and then a mile of grass at the end of them. And if you're at a dire emergency, you landed in the one with the red flares. In the center was amber, and then to the left that was green. So they put me in the middle one. I recall asked the control tower if they had any instructions for landing a brand new Lancaster on one wheel. They said, "No, Skipper, we've had lots of belly landings, but we never had a one wheel landing, but we know what's going to happen. As soon as you touch down, your right wingtip is going to touch the runway and you're going to ground loop." So you're coming in about 70 miles an hour. Sure enough, when it touched down, but just as we touched down, that oleo leg snapped off, but we already started to spin, and we spun over the center one, over the green one, and we ended up in the grass. So I could see the ambulance and the crash truck at the end of the runway, and the crash truck were following us. And as soon as aircraft stopped spinning, I think in about 10 or 15 seconds, they were on top of the aircraft, chopped open the cockpit, chopped out my harness, and I think I was out of the aircraft in about 15 seconds. In the meantime, they were spraying foam on the aircraft. So when it got light, we went out to have a look at the aircraft, saw all the bullet holes. And there were flying fortresses, Lancasters. Some of them had holes in them. You could actually walk through them. It was a real graveyard. Wow. But if those bullets had been 4 to 5 feet higher, then of course most of us would have been killed, because they were the pilot, the navigator, the wireless operator, the rear gunner. We'd all have been in the line of fire. So in that respect, we were rather fortunate. Their aim was as poor as it was, but they sent them to a aircraft recognition school for 4 or 5 weeks.